Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. This series of broadcasts over the last year plus and continuing on are aimed at bringing you interesting topics from the field of health, which of course necessitates us talking a bit about sickness because we have everybody using kind of double language today. They talk about health care, but it's really sick care. Health care would be that which makes you healthy, and of course sick care is treating sickness. So it's kind of, we know on one side it's one thing, but we talk about it on the other side using honorific terms so that it doesn't sound so bad. But any way you look at it, it's very expensive in our world today, and in particular in our country. The United States is extremely high, and as we talk about our subject, you're going to hear some interesting numbers if you haven't heard them. I have had people that had relatives, and such as husbands, wives, or close relatives or friends who have had organ transplants, and so over time I've put in a lot of study and studying the subject and understanding what's going on and what's involved and what the costs are. So that prompted me to produce a broadcast. Actually, it's two broadcasts, and this is the second of this short series called The Body Parts Supermarket, which is in essence what it's become. I had mentioned last broadcast that there's a book called The Body Bazaar, which talks about basically all the selling of organs and tissues and so forth, and all the things that have gone on with it. And we've talked a little bit about certain aspects of it in other broadcasts, but in this one we really concentrated it all together. And of course the problem stated is that we have more people having organs failing in their body, and to the point that they're no longer going to function. And so out of all of that has come to the foreground this whole idea of organ transplants. It's been going on for quite some time. The doctor who made it famous, Dr. Christian Bernard, many years ago, with a heart transplant. Unfortunately, the first heart transplant patient died from the transplant. The second one, but they fared better and lasted for a while. Wasn't a long time, but they lasted for a while. And so bit by bit, it has grown to a tremendous market. I guess that's the plus side, is that some people are going to make a lot of money out of it, in particular the health care, sick care industry. They're going to make a lot of money out of it and are making a lot of money. And we'll talk a little bit about the money side of the transplant business. But there's that is the plus side, see, because I happened to pick up a market research report that says that over the next several years, from 2010 to 2018, they should experience a growth rate of immunosuppressive drugs of about 6.1%, so that by about 2018, it should be a $5.6 billion market. So this is suggesting that if you want to have a good investment and make some money, then investing in the pharmaceuticals who are producing these immunosuppressive agents would be a very good investment. So some people are going to profit off of it. But as I say, the industry as a whole profits a lot, and we are going to be talking about that. We've gotten to the point, I mentioned last time about some of the sources, of course, the sources being either from a donor, such as a kidney or some part of their body that they could spare and still stay alive, especially for a friend, relative, or family member, so up close, as long as there's matches. And so that's been one big source, but that hasn't been enough. And I mentioned about the xenotransplantation, which is the growing of a special strain of pigs, that you can take organs from the pigs, and they have been genetically, or will be genetically altered, so that they will not be immediately rejected by the body. Now, we've talked before that there's two ways it can happen. One is a humoral response, which is an immediate response, and that's the type of immune response that could lead to anaphylaxis. And in that case, that's no good. So pig tissue, as a rule, outside of some of the, like heart valves, they've been able to have those stay in pretty good, made from more of a connective tissue. But in general, the organ transplants from pigs have not worked out at all because of this immediate reaction. So if they can transplant organs from pigs that have been altered in such a way that they can bypass that type of reaction, then they can give you immunosuppressants for the cellular response, which is a slower type of rejection. And they're anticipating that this is going to be a multi-billion-dollar market. There is a large corporate entity who is working in that direction and has invested a lot of money in producing these pigs. Now, as of yet, I don't know that it has become available, but they certainly anticipated it will, and that it's going to be very profitable. Now, today we want to start out by talking about the challenges to being an organ transplant patient. It's, of course, not simple, as always, and one of the big problems is getting put on a list. So I have a article that I had found, and it's called Challenges to Being an Organ Transplant Patient, and they have the various areas that are challenges. And of course, the very first is getting on a transplant list. As always happens in any industry, which organ transplanting has become an industry, a big business, there are organizations that are called transplant centers who maintain lists of those people who are potential transplant recipients, as well as being in contact with sources that would produce the organs. And in so doing, of course, it's up to them to make a decision of whether or not you even get on the list. Now, the first step of getting on the list is that you meet the qualifications, because they're not going to put anybody on the list. In other words, if you have another bad illness that might create a problem if you were to get a transplant and take all the immunosuppressant drugs, like cancer and some other things, or having had recent cancer, they're not going to put you on the list. There's some other qualifiers that are part of the process, but eventually, if you qualify, then they're going to not put you on a first come, first served list. What they do is they put you into what they call a pool. Okay, so that means that you're just somebody who is seeking a transplant, and no matter when you come into their pool, it's not going to determine whether you get the organ or not. That's only the first step. The next step is then that they have to have all the information about you as far as tissue typing, and there is a typing system called an HLA, a human leukocyte antigen factor of tissue typing, and they look for several different variables, blood type, etc., etc. And from all those, they have a profile of you. Now, then when an organ becomes available, of course, they've had this all computerized, and it will run through and sort out of this pool of potential recipients which ones are likely to get, let's say, accepted in that it potentially could work. Because they don't want to waste the organ. They don't want to put it into somebody that it's not going to work, or at least has a better chance of working. So then, once that happens, then they actually produce a list in terms of the group of people who could be a potential recipient. And then it's a matter then of waiting, and if everything is met, all the qualifications are met on this waiting list, then you might have the potential of being selected. Now, it says that the organ is offered to the transplant team of the first person on the list, which has now been created by whether or not you could be a potential recipient. And when a patient is selected, he or she must be available, healthy enough to undergo major surgery, willing to be transplanted immediately, which means when you get the call, you have to go right then. You have to drop everything and be able to be available because you can't waste too much time. We mentioned last time about the times involved. In some cases, it's only just a matter of very few hours from the time the organ has been removed until it needs to be transplanted, because death will set into the tissue and then it's no longer going to be a viable organ. So also, everything has to be ready and you have to be available and get there as fast as possible. And so here's what they're saying. Once a patient is selected and contacted and all testing is complete, it's scheduled and the transplant takes place. Being on the list does not guarantee an organ will ever become available. In other words, you could be on the list forever. Some patients will die waiting for an organ transplant. There are about 2 transplants completed for every donor available. There are 4 patients waiting for about forever, and they end up dying, and of course that takes them off the list. And it says, according to this, back in 2007, there were 98,200 people on the waiting list for an organ, and only 28,300 transplants took place. So that means that there were a lot of people on that list who were not going to get an organ. And then, of course, once you get the organ, again, we're talking about what it means to be a recipient, there's still the problem of rejection. Now, they're going to work very hard to give you medications that are going to shut down your immune system in order to do that. Now, of course, that means you also, there's no guarantee it will work. Most of the time, the drugs are strong enough that they will suppress the immune system, but it doesn't always work. And you'll be required to take the drugs for the rest of your life from that organ. In other words, if you live 10 years, you will have to take these drugs for 10 years. And of course, they come with side effects, which could mean more drugs to manage the side effects. So just to let you know that it's not a piece of pie or cake or a walkthrough, there's a lot involved. Now, we're not even talking about any other costs, but I know that the cost, and I know this because one of my patients' husband had opted to get a kidney transplant. There was a potential he could have avoided it that I knew and she knew, but he decided to get it, so that's fine. It's his choice, his body, and he's the one who should make that decision. But the cost of a transplant for the first year is very expensive, but it's not just that first year, and we're going to talk about that first year cost. But the problem is that the transplant drugs, and that's why this other article I was reading is telling you there's big money to be made in investing in pharmaceuticals who produce immunosuppressive agents for transplants. I know that in this particular case that the husband and wife were called in for a special conference when it looked like this organ was becoming available, and they had to sit down with the counselors, and they had to prove that as long as he lived with that organ, that he, either by insurance or by himself or a combination thereof, that they could guarantee that they could pay $5,000 a month for as long as that organ was in that person and he remained alive. Okay, that's $60,000 a year. Now, I also know that because in this particular case, this is a man who had been in business, made a good bit of money, and had some insurance also, that they were able to prove that they could pay the $5,000 a month. Now, The issue is that there were other people actually that were ahead of him, but because they could not produce the $5,000 a month, they remained on a waiting list and probably will wait until they die, because they're not going to be able to pay that $5,000 a month. So if you figure that it's cost $60,000 a year now, and you multiply that times 10 years, you're talking $600,000 if the person lived 10 years. So we're talking a huge amount of money. Whether paid by insurance, it's still being paid by somebody, because insurance companies don't just hand out money, they pay money out based on collecting premiums in. So other people are paying for that. It's not free. Somehow, I think in our world today, we get the idea that things are free, but there is no free lunch. When it comes to insurance, the insurance company, to stay operational, has to take in more money than what they pay out. And as the expenses of the payouts get greater, then the premiums get greater. And anybody who's paying their own insurance premiums have a pretty good idea of what kind of money you're talking about. And we also talk about getting things free from the government. Well, we don't get anything free from the government. That money was put in there or paid in there by somebody before it can be paid out. So somebody is paid for every penny that comes back to you, whether by insurance or by government. Somebody had to pay it in to begin with. And usually it ends up that the government overhead, of course, eats up a huge pile of that money. So for every dollar people pay in, maybe 5 or 10 cents can come back to somebody. So nothing is as simple as it seems. But at any rate, here we're talking about this cost factor. Now, some of the things that can happen are like with people with failing kidneys, they've got an additional problem. Because with the kidney failing, in order to stay alive until you can get a transplant, then you have the problem of dialysis. And dialysis is a costly affair, which costs in the neighborhood of plus or minus $40,000 a year for dialysis. So now you have another problem. Somebody's got to pay that $40,000 a year while you're sitting on that list. And if you're on there for 10 years before you finally give out, because actually dialysis is not a permanent intervention, it's a temporary intervention, and at some point it loses its efficacy and you're not going to make it. But at any rate, we've got the $40,000 plus or minus a year being paid just to keep the person alive until they receive a kidney. So that's a major issue. Now I'm going to throw in an aside, because this was given to me by a medical student at a lecture I did, who unfortunately, or fortunately I guess really, had gotten into medical school and was all excited about getting in medicine to help people, and suddenly began to see the inside of medicine and became so disenamored that she decided to drop out of medical school and go another direction. She still wants to help people, but she's going to do it in a different way. One will be by educating them. But at any rate, she made reference to some of the things that do go on in medicine, and getting to this dialysis issue, she told me that in this particular city that there is a doctor who has been recruiting a group of doctors to establish a series of dialysis centers in that area. And here is the rationale for doing that. He said that he knew that several of the drugs that are being prescribed for his patients and that the other doctors are prescribing for their patients are destroying the kidneys. And so he knows that in another 2 to 3 years that there's going to be a rash of people with kidney failure that are going to need dialysis. And so he said if they get geared up and ready to start opening these dialysis centers, they can take in $10,000 a day per center. And it can become a very, very profitable investment. Now, the thing that bothered her, of course, is he didn't suggest that maybe we might not want to prescribe those drugs that are going to destroy their kidneys, but rather we'll go ahead and prescribe them, and then when their kidneys are destroyed, we'll also make money off of doing the dialysis to keep them alive. And, of course, the people aren't going to have a choice. They're going to have to do it if their organs are destroyed. I dare say that he probably hasn't been telling his patients, well, you really shouldn't take this drug because it's going to destroy your kidneys and you're going to have to go on dialysis. But he's looking at it from a business standpoint. And unfortunately, I see more and more that medicine became an industry as opposed to a helping profession, unless it's a help yourself profession. But it certainly is not out there doing everything that can be done to help the patient to be cured, because basically, as I've mentioned before, the drugs that are on the market today are not designed to cure anything. They are actually designed to manage symptoms so you feel good and think you're better. And I meet with lots of people, and I think they still have a problem with understanding that when you palliate or when you give a drug that covers or manages a symptom, you have not corrected the problem. And in most cases, they don't know what the problem is because they don't bother to find out. All they know is, if you've got this symptom, we have this drug that'll make you feel better. And it doesn't make any difference what the cause is. In fact, it's probably good business because you're going to keep coming back every time the body gets sicker and more serious symptoms come up. They're going to be back for more expensive treatments until eventually we get down to an end point. Now, I have become convinced that all of the medical field has come to the conclusion that they have failed in terms of making people well. And you don't have to be blind to see that we have more people sick with more serious degenerative illnesses than ever, and yet we're talking about $1 trillion medical bill to treat people. And as I say, I don't call it health care, I call it sick care. And out of that, people are not getting better. The statistics do not support the fact that we are performing all these miracles. Now, I'm not saying here and there under some unusual circumstance that some surgeon is able to do some reconstructive work, or in some cases that the person has allowed a problem to go too long, that they might not have to cut a small piece out of the person for them to survive, and in that case, then they did the best they could with what they had to work with, which is somebody had let themselves go too far. But now if it's not the person, but it's the treatment they've received that's put them in that position, it raises in my mind serious ethical issues about what is going on in the field. Now, as I say, this cost thing becomes the major issue with a transplant. Now, I'm just going to give you a few instances so you know what I'm talking about when it comes to cost. Now, these are relatively recent because these are from 2011. And these are actual figures that were billed for transplants, so that you get an idea. So we can take any one organ like a heart. The heart, there's something called the pre-transplant treatment. And for a heart patient, we're talking $47,200. This is the average that's been billed for the pre-treatment. That's 30 days previous to the transplant. Also, the procurement of the heart, $80,400. Now, that wasn't paid to the person who donated, because in this country, see, we passed a law that the person donating could not get any money for it. That's not okay. But now the doctors can collect $80,400 for getting the organ ready, even though the donor got nothing. Now, to me, I'm wondering, who is the ethic that they're talking about? Is it unethical for a person donating to receive some compensation, but that's bad? But if the doctor is going to make $80,000 just taking that organ and getting it to the person to do the transplant, and charge $80,400 between the hospital drugs and surgeon, I have big questions about that. But nonetheless, that's the average that was billed for that. Now, then, you have the hospital transplant admission, which is $634,300 for this heart transplant. And then you have the physician doing the transplant, which is another $67,700. And then the post-treatment for 180 days after that with the immunosuppressants, etc., is, well, actually it's even before that, because it's $137,800 for the post-transplant. And then the immunosuppressants, another $30,300 during this 180 days. So grand total for a heart transplant, on the average in 2011, was $997,700, almost $1 million. Now, how many people's premium has to be paid in to an insurance company for how long to pay for that one heart transplant at about almost $1 million? Now, if you multiply that times the number of transplants, you can see that this is becoming an outlandish bill. Now, if the doctors are thinking that eventually everyone will have one or more organ transplants, you can imagine what kind of bill we're talking about. It's not going to be $1 trillion, it's going to be several trillion, and maybe even 50 trillion or 100 trillion. And where are we going to get that kind of money? Because there's not, you're pretty fast, you pass. Somebody did some math on that, and they figured out that it won't be long till the health sickness coverage, the cost will be so outlandish that would exceed our national gross product. In other words, we can't pay the bill. And so we're coming down to a precarious period of time, but in the meantime, a lot of people are making a lot of money until that thing happens. Now, with the kidney, as I talked about, that's one of the cheaper ones, actually. When you total up the pre-treatment, $17,000, the procurement of the organ, $67,200, the hospital, $91,200, the physician, $18,500, the post-transplant, another $50,800, and the immunosuppressants for that 180 days, $18,200. We're now talking $262,900 for a kidney. Now, some of the large ones, like a heart-lung, which is a multiple organ transplant, this one, the grand total, I'm not even going to do the breakdowns, grand total, $1,148,400. Now, I mentioned, I think last time, no, I didn't yet, we're going to talk about that, and maybe this is a good time to throw that in, because one of those problems with the transplant is something called cellular memory. And the reason I go ahead and mention it now is that there is a book out on the market called A Change of Heart. And this lady who wrote that had a heart-lung transplant. Well, anyhow, a short time after she had the transplant, she noticed that she suddenly started having a craving for chicken nuggets, which she had never had before, and a strong desire to ride motorcycles, which she had never had before. And the strangest of all, she started having dreams of some people that she had never seen before and had no idea who they were. And all of this aroused her curiosity. And so bit by bit, she was able to track down the source of the heart-lung donation and found out that it was a 18 or 19-year-old boy who was a motorcyclist and who had actually been addicted to chicken nuggets, and he was killed in an accident on the motorcycle, and his leather jacket pockets were full of chicken nuggets. Anyhow, as she talked to the family of this boy and described the dreams and the people she was dreaming about, it ended up that they were actually people out of his life. So now, what that says is that a memory from that person that the organ came from came along with the organ and became incorporated into the person who was the recipient of it. Now, this is not a single isolated case, because I read several, in fact a lot more than several, many cases, people receiving organs and suddenly becoming a kleptomaniac, wanting to steal things which they'd never had before, or wanting to do other types of strange things that they had never but now felt a compulsion to do. And in some cases, again, about thinking or having dreams about people they had never met. Now, if that sounds strange to you, then it would be worthwhile to read a book by a researcher, a PhD researcher by the name of Candace Pert. And it's called Molecules of Emotion. And basically, what she has been able to establish that there's informational molecules called neuropeptides in the human system that carry information throughout the body, and her final hypothesis is that the memory and unconscious of a person is stored throughout the body in every cell of the body. In other words, there's without getting into the technicalities, there's a rationale for that because there's structures within the cells called microtubules that it appears are structures, very, very, very minute structures that store information much like the memory of a computer. And so it appears that our memories are scattered through the whole body, not just in the brain as some people would like to think, but everywhere in the body. So that means if you take a piece out of that body, along with that piece comes a piece of the memory of the person that it came from that is stored within the cellular structure. Now there's a psychologist from Hawaii, now deceased, who wrote a book called The Heart's Code. His name is Pearsall, and that will be on our list of books. Pearsall has done a lot of study as a psychologist with a lot of people with heart transplants in particular, and noted the changes that have taken place. Now, I think we've talked about it before, we may not have, but that the heart really is a second brain within the body, and that it actually produces neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and so forth, along with several other neuropeptides, and that it's part of the whole mind part of a human being. And there's a lot of information out about that, and that the heart actually works in conjunction with the brain to regulate the whole body. It actually serves as a pacer. And as I say, we don't really have time to get into it in detail, and at some point we probably will talk about some of the unusual things that you never think about. And so, at any rate, these people get a piece of memory. Now, I know of one case in Australia where a young teenager was given a new liver and it did something else. And again, this is some areas that we don't have time to talk about in detail, but at some point we probably will talk more about it because we can do maybe a whole broadcast on some of these unusual things you never hear about. But in her case, she received a new liver and a transplant, and in the process, it altered her genetic and changed her blood type to the type of blood that the person had who the organ came from. Okay, so now you're talking about genetic effects. And so I know that this is true because I know a researcher, he's in Canada, and has done a lot of work with some elements in the blood. And as I say, this is highly technical and probably a lot of people never even gave it a thought, but there are certain elements in the blood that contribute to the way the body works and helps the body in the way it works, but also seems to help in the genetics. And this researcher took two rabbits actually, and he isolated these factors, which incidentally only shows up under dark field microscopy, which is rarely used by regular medicine in terms of patients and so forth. But under dark field microscopy, there are certain of these elements that show up that are visible. And consequently, if those, in this case, in the one rabbit, he isolated them and he injected them into a second rabbit. And over a period of time, the second rabbit took on the appearance more of the first rabbit. And then to carry it a step farther, he took some tissue from the first rabbit and grafted it to the second rabbit, which normally would have been rejected, and it attached and grew as though it belonged there. So that tells me, and of course told him, that actually the genetic had been altered by these factors out of the blood. Now, I guess it might depend on how many were there, but evidently in the case of the liver transplant to the young girl, the liver, of course, usually has huge amounts of blood, and I would think in most cases they would drain the organ before they implanted it, but I'm thinking in this case there was enough blood still present in the transplanted organ that these factors got into her bloodstream and altered her genetic to be more like the person that the blood or the organ came from, and the blood from that person. Anyhow, her type changed. Now, that only way that could change is that the genetic would have to change. So there's a lot of little anomalies that are out there that you don't hear about, and maybe that's what we'll call it, some interesting anomalies that's come out of research. So, my feeling is that that's one of the things that wasn't talked about when it said the issues of being a recipient, is that this potential is there. And of course, I'm sure they wouldn't want to tell that to people, that you might be finding yourself compelled to start stealing things out of stores, or you might be compelled to go into skydiving suddenly, or whatever, because of information that was stored in the tissue that you received in the transplant. So enough about the cost, but I just wanted you to know that then after these high costs, like the heart being almost $1 million to get, now you're going to spend $60,000 a year for every year that you have that heart for as long as you live. Now that's only part of the problem. The other part is that, as I say, it creates many adverse effects, these immunosuppressive drugs. So that's a problem. So that it ends up with more medications, which adds to the price of the $60,000 a year. But then, on top of that, the person who has received the organ is walking in a tight wire, like a high wire. And they have to be very careful because they could fall off, pick up a virus that could go through their whole body with no immune system, and there's nothing could be done for it. So I would say a lot of the transplant individuals end up, they're being wiped out by either systemic fungus, candida, that fills their lungs up, or that they pick up a virus that nothing can be done for. And so it's no simple matter that you're always living on the edge, so to speak. To me, it would be like walking right on the edge of a high cliff all the time. To be careful you don't stumble. So you have to learn to be a little careful where you go and who you associate with, and a lot of factors. So it's not so simple. Now, what happens if then you have money and you're paying $5,000 a month to keep the organ in, and down the road you have a sudden business reversal, or something happens that you lose all or most of your money and you can't pay the $5,000 a month anymore. And on top of it, if you have insurance, insurance sometimes have long-range caps on them that once you have used it to this level, this insurance pays no longer on that particular issue. So that creates a problem. So it's something you definitely need to think about. And one of the last things I'm going to be suggesting is that I would seriously consider to avoid the transplant in the first place. Because once the immunosuppressive drugs, if you can't afford them, your body rapidly is going to reject the organ, and that's the end anyhow. So basically, you've spent a lot of money and delayed it down to a certain point. But that's only a part of it. We want to put this on our website and make it available. This is a study that was done by an investigative writer, and he calls it the nasty side of organ transplanting, the cannibalistic nature of transplant medicine. So I thought you might want to read it. It's a pretty good size. It's all about 3/4 of an inch thick, so there's a lot of pages, pushing 150 pages, with a lot of resources at the end of it to get all kinds of information. So he's not just talking through his hat, so to speak. This is stuff that he's gone out and done a lot of investigating. And he says, or he quotes somebody at the bottom that says, transplant technology may be compared to an evil genie let out of a bottle and now won't return. So now we're stuck. In essence, what they're saying is now we're stuck with it. I can't read too much of it, but in the foreword to the 3rd edition of this, he talks about what prompted him. He said it was Professor Geoffrey Dallenberg from the South Australian Organ Donation Agency who got me interested in organ transplanting. In other words, some comment that was made aroused his interest and got him looking into all this. And here's what this professor said. Transplant coordinators would no longer be accepting a soft no from relatives who expressed reluctance to donate their next of kin's organs. He said, if a family says no, we need to know why. In the past, we haven't pursued that avenue. We've said that that's their right and leave it at that. What we're doing now is still respecting that decision, but we want to know why. Bottom line is they're going to be putting more and more pressure on every available source, so to speak, of organs from everyone that they can. Now, I mentioned last time about the way it's been going, that they're talking about not having a donor card. I mean, these are the laws that are being discussed that says you're a donor, but you would have to carry an opt-out card that says you don't want to be a donor, or automatically the person that dies, their organs will be all harvested automatically. So it no longer will be, I'm willing to donate, but I don't want to donate. We'll have to be very clear, otherwise they'll take it. Now, some have gone so far as to say that there should be a law that says every person who dies, their organs have to be available for transplant if they're usable. In other words, everyone would be forced to do it. There would be no opting out. So that's one of the big directions. So this soft statement saying, well, we're not just going to accept that they don't want to donate. We want to know why they don't want to donate. And he said that was 9 years ago. And he said in 2005, Australian state government tightened the screws further. Relatives can no longer veto next of kin's organ harvesting unless they have sincerely held beliefs. I have not been able to locate a government representative who will define a sincerely held belief, nor will any donation agency say who in the hospital determines whether the belief is sincerely held or not. We've come a long way since Professor Dallenberg's softly approach. Governments have begun usurping family control of their next of kin's brain dead bodies. In other words, people who are considered brain dead, they're just automatically going to take the organs. And I think that, as I say, at the rate it's going to get worse and worse because more and more people's organs are failing. Now, why are they failing? Well, we mentioned some at the beginning, because of our modern lifestyle is killing us. It's not just the fact of, as this one book that I have called Overtreated, Why Too Much Medicine is Making Us Sicker and Poorer. And so a lot of it is drug related. The organs are damaged, as I mentioned, by the group that are gearing up to do the dialysis of all these kidney failures due to the drugs. It's not just that, but it's the toxins in the environment, the poor quality food, the high stress, the life that people live today. All of this is adding up to, if you don't take care of your organs, one or more are going to fail. And if they fail, you're going to be in deep trouble. Okay, so the increased talk of compensating living people in richer countries for discomfort and travel expenses while donating a kidney masks plans for organ selling in these nations. In other words, at some point down the road, even though the U.S. there's a law that says you can't be paid for an organ donation, I think we're going to see things change, and that's going to have to be another source. The revival of non-heart-beating vital organ donation sounds initially like a return to the good old days when organ removal began well after the donor's heart ceased beating. The new version is different, where organ removal begins without even the fictitious brain death diagnosis. In other words, if the person's not responding and they're still breathing, then it says that the patient is chilled and perfused with potentially injurious harvesting drugs while still being treated therapeutically in the hospital. Life support, specifically mechanical ventilation, is removed as long as 2 minutes after cardiac arrest. The patient is classed as dead. Surgery to remove his organ then begins, even though cardiopulmonary resuscitation might well be successful at this stage. It may indeed be performed for the sake of the organs, and we may then have the strange scenario where the heart is still pumping oxygenated blood through the body, although it is declared a corpse, as in the case when organs are taken after a diagnosis of brain death. In other words, we're getting down to the issue of when is the person dead when you start taking their organs? Because somebody who's had a head injury and is unconscious, they're developing tests to determine if they're really brain dead or not. And if they're brain dead, then it's okay to start taking their organs out, which in essence, they're not a corpse at that point, but they will be as soon as they cut their heart or some of the organs out. So now we're getting into a gray area of when is the person really dead before you start taking their organs. Now, I'm not going to go into all the things in this book, but the fact is, if somebody's on a ventilator because there is damage, but they're still, everything is working, even though they're unconscious, one of the tests is to disconnect the ventilator for a certain period of time, which in itself can be fatal to the person. So actually one of the tests that they might use to determine whether they're really brain dead. And that's become another big issue. How do you know when the person's really brain dead? And it would really mean when the brain stem is so damaged that they are not going to recover. But there's no way of knowing that for sure. And so now we get into the thing of what he's talking about is the different forms that they start harvesting. The first type is of tissue from truly dead bodies of consenting adults who made informed choices. They are given full healing treatment while alive, and at a decent interval after death, their body materials are taken to be used for effective healing purposes. Bone, skin, eyes, tendons, veins, heart valves are characteristically removed from these bodies. Now, they can't take the organs because by the time they're actually dead, nothing was ready, and so therefore they can't do it. The other extreme of harvesting of organs, still viable enough to be able to function for years in a different body, begins while the donor is still alive, though declared brain dead. The patient's heart continues beating, the body is warm, and blood flows throughout the organ removal procedure. It's the harvest surgeon's knife that ends up killing the person. The third form of harvesting uses non-heart-beating donors who are dependent on life support measures, typically mechanical ventilation, who haven't met the criteria by which they may have been declared brain dead. Now, as I say, there's some strange things going on because when somebody's been in a serious accident and has significant damage, when does the doctor stop trying to revive them and treat them and declare them brain dead with a transplant team standing by to grab the organs and go with them? And so these are some of the issues that this guy raises, and so I think it would be to your advantage to read this whole paper, or actually it's like a book. And so he gets into issues like an invented death. So are they really dead or what? Now, the other thing that's really going to grab you is that these people who are declared brain dead, when they cut through the tissue with the scalpel, the body starts jumping and jerking and moving, and now then they have trouble that they either have to hold them down or they do it without anesthetizing them. So evidently the body's feeling pain and the person is responding. So the fact is, are they really brain dead or not? So these are some important issues, and he gets into a lot of these things. And even some of the nurses and doctors who do some of these procedures talk about how uneasy they feel about the whole thing as to whether the person really is dead or whether it's the process of cutting out their liver, heart, and organs that is what really wipes them out. Because they've seen all this take place. The movement, in fact, in a few cases, the body's even set up and hold their arms out. And so it's not as clean and neat as you're led to believe. So these are all issues that really need to be thought about. And then there's a bunch of them. The apnea brain test, which is one of those they came up with, is see if they can breathe after you remove the breathing from them for a while. And of course, if you leave it very long, they're going to die anyhow. And they do leave it for a while. So there really is no clear-cut way of knowing whether, in fact, the person is dead when they start taking out the organs. I was just looking through here a moment to see if there's anything else, because we're not going to have time to get into all this stuff, but to see if there's anything else that stands out. Well, he gives an example here. Organ donors may be denied protective barbiturates because people with brain injuries, barbiturates can actually, they found beneficial in helping them survive and recover. And here's one called Back from the Brain Dead. The difficulty in ascertaining whether a potential organ donor is dead was exemplified by a University of Bonn Medical Center study where 213 who were initially thought to be mortally brain damaged defied the fatal prognosis and made recoveries. The study involved non-neurosurgical patients, mostly suffering brain trauma injury and intracranial hemorrhages or strokes. The decision to terminate further treatments were made after stringent and extensive brain activity testing. Yes, despite this, the two such end-of-life diagnoses were subsequently reversed and the patient made unexpected recoveries. Now, under the way that the harvesting is being done, those two would have not survived because they would have taken the organs because they were pronounced brain dead and irreversible. When such misdiagnoses are made despite comprehensive testing, one might also doubt similar diagnoses if patients identified as organ donors when their diagnoses are made solely on the basis of simple bedside tests performed only after a few hours of ventilator-dependent coma. Now, I had an acquaintance, a doctor of chiropractic that was in an educational program with me in another state, and she was going to her office one morning to work, and as she was looking out, all of a sudden she saw a car coming straight at her, and she felt like a little bit later she opened her eyes again, and it was now 6 months later. She was in a hospital bed, and this had happened early in the spring, and it was now snowing outside, and so she was in a coma for 6 months, and she fully recovered. In fact, she recovered, ended up deciding that she was close to death and has missed a lot of things she wanted to do, so she ended up selling out her office and doing some traveling, especially to Australia. She ended up visiting the schools there and some of the doctors for a couple of years, seeing what was going on in Australia. Ended up not liking what was happening to the Aborigines and getting together with them and saying, you know, you need to start a business, make some money, you won't be harassed as much. Bottom line is they did that, it worked out well, and they were so happy they took her to the outback for several months and told her all kinds of things about their history and their philosophy and the things that they know and do that no one else knew. She came back to the U.S., wrote a book about it, and it became a top seller on the New York Times list. Anyhow, had they started harvesting her organs, she wouldn't have been around to do any of that. So the problem is that it's not that simple. And so it says here's something he says: early labeling of these patients as dead for transplant purposes during the past 3 decades has diverted medical researchers away from developing novel therapeutic resources that could already have saved many thousands of human lives throughout the world. In other words, as procedures came along, some of these people that they were willing to pronounce dead and start taking their organs were in fact recoverable and could be recoverable. I think that's probably all the time we're going to have to cover his material, but there's a lot of it in here that is really worth considering. And here they say some nations don't consider medical brain death criteria valid. Pakistan and Romania don't recognize brain death, saying the person is still alive. Most Jews don't recognize brain death, thus organ donation is rare in Israel. Thailand doesn't accept the concept of whole brain death or brain stem death. Harvesters cutting organs from bodies with beating hearts are charged with murder, which carries a death penalty. So they can't do it in these areas because they realize that some of these people do recover. But the problem is that the doctor is put in a precarious position because they have a person waiting for an organ. They pull in a transplant team because this person has brain injury, and they can become a potential donor because they have a donor card, and their stats show that they could be a match for somebody. And so here they are, the doctor is supposedly trying to revive them, but at the same time sitting by his side is a transplant team ready to start harvesting organs. So this creates a big dilemma. And so there's a lot of things in here said that, as I say, I don't have time to read, but I think this is really going to give you a much broader perspective on the whole issue, and it's not nearly as simple as it's made out to be. I hope I'm kind of getting you awakened to this whole issue, because once I started looking into it, I found out that there's a lot more to it than what I was thinking. So now, the next question is, if there isn't enough organs and the pig program doesn't work out, then what are the alternatives? Because we are killing people's organs by medications and by our lifestyle and by the environmental toxins and all these things going on. So how are we going to handle that? Well, there's some other issues that are in process. This one I thought was kind of interesting, called Miracle Grow. In the future, people who need a body part may get their own back regrown in the lab from their own cells. So the fact is that there is a lot of research going on where they're thinking they could take some of your tissue and develop a process. They could grow you a new organ from the genetic information in that tissue. Now, of course, it hasn't worked out yet that they are, at least that we know of, that they've been able to do it, but that's certainly a part of it. And I had picked up some information. This is from actually government material, Human Genome Project information. The possibility of human cloning was raised when the Scottish scientists at the Roslin Institute created the much celebrated sheep dolly. Now, there's a big problem with that. I don't know how much you followed that whole thing, but they took this genetic information from an adult sheep and they actually took out the genetic material of a fertilized ovum, actually, or they actually took it out before it was fertilized, put the other DNA material and ended up with a fertilized ovum, and they put it in another sheep, and it attached and grew, and Dolly was born. Now, as Dolly grew up, guess what happened? Dolly aged rapidly until she caught up to the sheep age that the DNA information came from. So in pretty fast order, she aged several years in a short period of time, and so that kind of threw a little bit of a wrench in the gear. So probably the only way that this would happen, if you're going to use your tissue, is that they actually had your cells saved from the time you were born, and then could take that information and form a new organ. It might work. There's just a lot of technicalities about it yet, but I know that the cloning has gone, in my mind, it's gone a lot farther than what they let out to the public. I think that the Dolly thing was kind of putting out your fleece, and I thought it was kind of ironic that they chose the sheep. I don't know if you heard that statement about putting out your fleece to get an answer. That was a biblical statement about putting some wool from a sheep out, and if the dew did not wet it and wet all the material around it, there was a question attached to that. That gave you an answer that yes or no. If it was not covered with dew and the rest of the surrounding ground was, then the answer was yes. If it became wet just like the rest of the ground, the answer was no. So that's been called of laying out your fleece, and I thought it interesting they picked a sheep to lay out the fleece in front of the public about cloning. And of course there was a big uproar, so then they said, well, someday we might do humans. If you were to ask me, my guess would be that it's already been done, and they just wanted to see how acceptable it would be to the public. Now, what someone is like that has been cloned, I have no idea. And so what a clone would be like it would be interesting to find out, whether it would be like an identical twin or what all this. There's a lot of issues in my mind. So anyhow, the big move is, and this is another paper that I've run into called Tissue Engineering for Tissue and Organ Regeneration. So there's a lot of things going on in that area. Another big one called Medicine's Cutting Edge Regrowing Organs. I guess it all remains to be seen. Here's another one from a medical or Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and they have a big group of scientists, biomedical and chemical engineering, cell molecular biology, biochemistry, pharmacology, physiology, material science, nanotechnology, genomics, proteomics, surgery, and medicine work side by side to translate the science of regenerative medicine into clinical therapies. In other words, again, wanting to build a new organ or at least tissue to repair an organ. So there's a lot going on in these areas, and here's a huge study. This is a big one. Tissue Engineering for Tissue and Organ Regeneration. Now this is a huge study of everything that's known and things that have been done so far, and how far they've come with it. So there's a lot of material there. I don't know if we'll put this one up or not, but it's a big one. It's out there. Now they even have articles out now about how organ donation works, so that if you're going to be a donor, one was being a recipient, now here's the instructions on being a donor, what you're probably going to have to go through, in fact will go through. And they cover some things like the organ black market, which I mentioned before, where they either have talked people into selling one of their kidneys or tissue, and or the people who go out and hit somebody on the head and take their organ. Now they like to really play that one down because they don't want people to think about that. Now the other thing, of course, when we're talking about the money thing is, I'm just going to throw this in, here's a big study called Too Poor for Transplant, Finance and Insurance Issues in Transplant Ethics. So bottom line is the poor are going to end up being the donors, and the more wealthy are going to be the recipients, because if the people can't afford it. They can't even pay the $5,000 a month to keep the organ in, let alone all the other expenses, and especially if they had no insurance. They can't pay all the expenses to even get the organ, to get it put in. our deeply unethical national organ policy, in our zeal to protect the poor from exploitation by the moneyed classes, the organ donor alone among all the participants in the world of transplantation receives no benefit. So that's just what I said. The poor donate the organs and the rich can afford to get them. So it's not quite as not quite as equal as you might think. So I mentioned a lot of the debates and so forth. Now we're running short of time, but there is at least one other issue. These are some of the alternatives that have been suggested since there's not enough organs to go around, and since the xenotransplantation with the pigs hasn't developed yet to the point that they're doing that. There is another solution, and that is probably a whole lot cheaper, is to solve the problem why all the organs are being destroyed. And I know that there are natural things you can do to protect the organs, to actually improve the organs. And I know for a fact over the years that we have had people get off of dialysis and their kidneys recover and them not have to have either dialysis or a transplant. And that's what happened with the patient I was talking about. They had suggested she had suggested to her husband actually that he do natural treatment and avoid the transplant, but the medical people assured him there's nothing to it. You know, you walk in, you walk out with a new organ and everything is great. He found out there were a lot of complications. It wasn't quite that simple, and of course very expensive complications on top of that. So there are ways that we can protect our organs from all the poisons of the environment. There's ways that we can detox the body, and there's things we can do to strengthen the organs. So it's strange that there is nothing being spent in prevention, only ways to get more organs and to make more money. Now I realize that the people that I've seen actually get off of dialysis, they spent maybe a couple, $3,000 to save their kidneys. And when you measure that to $250,000 for a transplant, plus $60,000 a year until you die, not counting the cost of the dialysis, which is about $40,000 a year until you get the organ, I realize that that's an awful lot of money to spend $3,000 to save your organ, as opposed to spending $250,000 to $500,000 to get the organ and then pay for keeping it in. So I guess we're running down to the end of our time. I hope that I've piqued your interest a little bit to look into it farther, and you can check on our website for some of the books that I've mentioned about. And also we want to get this one on the nasty side of the transplants that you can read, because there's a lot of considerations in there. This writer did a very good job, interviewed a lot of people, a lot of doctors, a lot of nurses, donor centers, I mean just on and on and on to put this together. And it's one of those who give you a realistic look at the whole process of organ donation, organ harvesting, and transplants. So we're running out of time, so until our next broadcast, I'm hoping that we're informing you to the point that you feel that you're becoming an educated consumer, because that's really what my intent is, to give you enough information that you know the right questions to ask when somebody is suggesting something, especially something radical, that you do. So until the next broadcast, we want you to become healthier and healthier, and hope you just keep learning and learning.